This is the story of old Artful, but this is my version of it. The wind and the rain were blowing across the square at Lanston as the traveller made his way towards St Mary's. The weather was so bad that he decided to carry on, through Lanston, down the hill, up to St Stephen's and along the back road towards Tresmere. But he did stop when at one point he could smell baking. Meat, onions, pastry, but of such deliciousness as he'd never smelt before. And he was a man who knew about temptation. So he wrapped his cloak close around him and he stepped onto the path up to the little cottage where he knocked at the door. Inside the cottage, Dolly Tremellan had just put one batch of pasties out to cool and was rolling the pastry for the second batch when she heard the knock at the door. But her hands were covered with pastry, so rather than stop and wash them, she called over her shoulder, "Come on in, the door's open." She turned to see a tall, dark, handsome stranger crossing the threshold. He saw a short, dumpy woman in an apron, definitely the wrong side of 50, and with her hands covered with flour. Nevertheless, his first words were, "Oh, sorry to bother you, my dear. Is your mummy at home?" Now, Dolly Tremellan knew flattery when she heard it, but she didn't hear it nearly often enough these days. So she smiled and simpered and explained that she was, in fact, the lady of the house. "You look so young," he said, and such magnificent baking. One could hardly imagine that it could taste as good as it looks. His fingers crept towards one of the pasties, and he was rapped over the knuckles by a wooden spoon. "That is Farmer Heel's pasty," said Dolly. "I make pasties for all the folks around here." "And I applaud their choice," said the stranger. "You must be a magnificent cook." "I'm probably the best pasty maker in this part of Cornwall," Dolly replied. And under the dark black hat, some red eyes glowed. Here was a soul who could be caught. "But listen to me chatting," she said. "You sit yourself down by the fire. I'll make us some tea, and when I finish this batch, you can tell me all about things." The stranger sat down and watched as she took her sharp knife, chopped the meat, sliced the veg, rolled the pastry, and crimped the edge. And when the batch was safely in the oven, she pulled up a chair by the fire and made some tea. "Where are you from?" she said. "Well, here and thereabouts," said the stranger, "but this is one of my rare trips across the Tamar, and I have to say I am mightily impressed with the standard of baking." He looked wistfully at the pasties, and Dolly relented, and soon he'd not only had a pasty, he'd also had some figgy pudding and some lammy pie, and as he wiped the crumbs from his mouth, he exclaimed, "You are a magnificent cook. Where did you learn such skills in an out-of-the-way place like this?" "Well," said Dolly, I am entirely self-taught. I buy all my local ingredients locally, and I'm very conscious of organic produce and air mice. In fact," she said, "I reckon I could make a pasty out of anything. I bet the devil himself couldn't do better." There was a flash of fire in the eyes. "Really?" Rather too late, Dolly noticed that where she'd been rolling the pastry, some flour had fallen on the floor, and in the dust were the footprints, not of boots or shoes, but cloven hooves. At that point, Dolly realised that she had been entertaining the devil. "A wager," said Trevor. "A wager? What a splendid idea. I tell you what, why don't we have a little competition? Perhaps a sort of bake-off? You make me 3 pasties on 3 days from the ingredients that I specify. And then, if you succeed as well as this," he indicated the baking, "then you can set me a task to make you something. But I warn you, my tasks are very difficult, and if you fail, then you must come and clean my ovens for all eternity. And I have a great many ovens." But Dolly was not going to be bested in a baking competition. So she agreed, and the black claw hand and the white flowered hand shook on the deal. "Now," said the devil, "here is your first task. Bake me a pasty, fill it with meat from a bald-headed creature with only 2 feet. And then he wrapped his cloak round him and swept out of the door. But he didn't go straight home. You see, he was having second thoughts. The devil is not well known for his culinary expertise. He's more of a spit roast and barbecue man, if you get my meaning. So he decided that he'd better get in a bit of practice, just in case, in the very unlikely case that he might not succeed. The kitchens of hell are very hot, and those of you who make pastry know that that's not a good place to make pastry. But the devil tried. He tried very hard. He took flour, he took fat, he took water, and it stuck to everything and congealed and dropped on the floor and on the table. And in the end, he shoved the whole disgusting mess in the oven, and there was a flash of smoke and a smell of cinders. And he looked at the result and decided that he had better win this competition. Next morning, Dolly took her shopping basket and went down to Lansdowne Market to buy the ingredients for this unusual pasty. And at this point, I would ask you, what did she buy? A bald-headed creature with only 2 feet? You've probably guessed. It's a chicken. She came home, took out her sharp knives, chopped the meat, sliced the veg, rolled the pastry, crimped the edge, and popped it in the oven. About lunchtime, the devil came confidently up the path and knocked at the door. "Well, my dear," he said, "I do hope you've packed enough clothes for the trip." "Oh, I don't think I'll be going anywhere," said Dolly, "but do have a bite of my chicken pasty before you go." Well, the devil wasn't too disappointed, and actually, by the time he'd eaten the first pasty and a couple of others just to make sure, he decided that it was no problem. He could come back tomorrow with a much harder task. "You have done well, my dear," he said, as he wiped the crumbs from his mouth. "But tomorrow will be a different story. I want you to bake me a pasty from something that has no legs, 1 foot, no eyes or hair. Bake me a pasty tasty and rare." And then he wrapped his cloak round him and went home. Next morning, Dolly took her basket and went to fetch the ingredients for this unusual pasty. She went actually down to the seashore, where she collected the animal that has no legs, 1 foot, no eyes or hair. She scraped some limpets off the rock. It is not widely known that limpet and raisin pasty is one of the rarer Cornish delicacies. In fact, it is possible, or was at one time, for a family at Constantine to pay their annual rent in lentil and raisin pie. About noon, the devil swung round the gate and marched in without even knocking. "Right, my dear," he said, "toothbrush, Brillo pads, that's all you need. You're coming with me." "I don't think so," said Dolly, "but do have a raisin and limpet pasty before you go." The devil was a little disconcerted. He hadn't actually expected her to achieve this, and he wasn't sure he'd ever tasted anything quite like that. But it did smell good, and after he got used to the idea of limpets and raisins, it actually tasted quite nice. Dolly had been heavy-handed with the raisins. "Well, my dear," he said, wiping the crumbs from his mouth, "that was excellent. And really, I'm sorry to say that, tomorrow you will be coming with me because I have a much harder task for you tomorrow. Here is your challenge for tomorrow. No legs, scales, or fins. Yet by land and by sea I can travel for miles. What pie will I be?" and then he wrapped his cloak round him and swept away. Next morning, Dolly took her basket down to Lansdowne Market. And now you're thinking, what on earth did she buy? No legs, scales or fins, but land and by sea can travel for miles. What can that be? Well, those of you who have explored the more exotic end of the food market will know that eels are able to travel across land if the grass is wet, and also travel miles by sea. Dolly bought some eels, brought them home, took out her long sharp knife, chopped the meat, sliced the veg, rolled the pastry and crimped the edge. At lunchtime, the devil barged straight in. Right, he said, off we go then. I don't think so, said Dolly, and the devil sniffed the air. This was extraordinary. He'd never smelt anything like that. Dolly brought out an enormous raised pie with a top crust and cut into it with a knife. Inside was succulent white flesh and a thick layer of green jelly on top. You can tell I don't eat fish, can't you? But it did smell rather good. In fact, it smelt good enough for the devil to have not just one slice, but two, and then another one to make sure. But as he finished it up, he began to have some doubts. Well, my dear, he tried to be jocular. That was fun, wasn't it? That was just one of those little games that people love to play. Well, thank you very much. I'll be on my way then. Oh, no, you won't, said Dolly, taking out her long, sharp knife. We have a wager, you and I. If I succeeded, then you must bake something for me. And I think I'd rather like a pasty containing the meat from a creature with 2 cloven hooves, a tail and 2 little horns. In fact, she said, branching back, I'll bake it for you. And she advanced towards him. The devil took one look and did a double back somersault out of the window, crossed the Tamar and went back to Devon, where I believe he does still reside. But, ladies, the wager still stands. So if at any point you see someone with 2 horns and a tail and 2 cloven hoofs, you are entitled to make a pasty of him. And that is the story of the flight of old Artful.
I've got to tell you how I got into the spoken word was through a gentleman called Donald Rowe, and he ran the Cornish Literary Guild, and he introduced me to a lot of Cornish writers, not personally, but to their works. And one of them was the works of Charles Causley. So I'm going to do another Charles Causley poem, and to me it's a very hard-hitting poem, and it's still very relevant today, even though it was written before 1975. Timothy Winters goes to school, his eyes as wide as a football pool, ears like bombs and teeth like splinters. A blitz of a boy is Timothy Winters. His belly is white, his neck is dark, his hair is an exclamation mark. His clothes are enough to scare a crow, and through his breeches the blue winds blow. When teacher talks, he won't say a word, and he shoots down dead the arithmetic bird. He licks the pattern off the plate, and he's not heard of the welfare state. Timothy Winters has bleeding feet. He lives in a house on Sewage Street. He sleeps on a sack on the kitchen floor, and they say there aren't boys like him anymore. Old man Winters likes his beer, and his missus ran off with a bombardier. Grandma sits in the grate with a gin, and Timothy's dosed on an aspirin. The welfare worker lies awake, for the law's as tricky as a 10-foot snake. And Timothy Winters drinks his cup and slowly goes on growing up. At morning prayers, the Master helps for children less fortunate than ourselves. And the loudest response in the room is when Timothy Winters roars, Amen. So come one angel, come on 10. Timothy Winters says Amen. Amen, amen. Amen, amen. Timothy Winters, Lord, amen. Timothy Winters by Charles Causley.